Intersection Education Podcast.
Today I'm speaking with Erika Nelson. Erika is an experienced middle and high school teacher and administrator from the east coast of Canada who's landed at the University of Alberta in pursuit of her PhD in Educational Administration and Leadership. Since beginning doctoral work in 2021, she's instructed at the U of A's B.Ed program and has also dabbled in the Ministry of Education's newish Alberta Teaching Profession Commission. As Erika rounds the corner in completing her dissertation, she is more passionate than ever about school leadership. Erika's research focuses on the impact of parents' use of social media on the professional identity of principals. Here's my conversation with Erika Nelson. Erika, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How are you tonight?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm also looking forward to talking with you, and anytime I get to talk about my research or share what I've found, I certainly welcome the opportunity. So I'm excited to get into it a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with maybe the end, but I'd like to know, what is one thing that at the end of this interview that you hope the people listening will think differently about or reconsider as part of their educational leadership practice?
Sure. Well, spoiler alert. I think that for most people in ed leadership, my findings are not going to be revelatory. I think that after this interview is done, people maybe understand a little bit more about themselves and their role in ed leadership, and why they might feel the way that they do feel sometimes about themselves as principals. When I'm reading, this is all about social media. So when I'm reading post after post after post, I'm seeing the same sentiments among educators and educational leaders. And so I think that by allowing principals to see that there are some things that maybe explain what's happening, or maybe give them the permission that it's okay to feel the way they're feeling. They're not alone. And for some, they might feel a little discouraged. So I'm hoping to shed some light maybe on those emotions that people keep telling me about, and maybe put a little data behind it at the same time.
I love it. So let's get there. Tell us a little bit about your research. What are you investigating? What are you looking at in terms of education or education leadership?
Sure. So my research comes directly from my own personal experience in ed leadership. So my experience as an administrator and some of the things that kept me up at night, I think. So my master's supervisor, I'll shout out to Dr. Wendy Buckhurst-Heng at Crandall University. She was one of the first people who really encouraged me to look into doctoral work. And she said to me that the key to success was finding a problem that you could perseverate on, that you could obsess over for years. I'm trying to stick to 4 years. And that's really how I came to my research question of how parents' use of social media impacts the professional identity of principals. So it sounds maybe more complicated, and there's certainly an evolution there. I didn't just wake up and write that research question out. But I knew that my obsession, so my reason that I was kept up at night, was kind of in examining this external force, these parents on social media. And so how do they, this outside force, have this power to control my internal feelings and, who I felt like and how I saw myself in my leadership role. And so through all that, I came to finally professional identity. This is who I am as a leader, who I am in the role of principal.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask next, because I think that identity or professional identity, when you talk about that, it's probably good to define that word, and at least how you saw it or how you used it in your research, and perhaps some nuances around professional identity that you found.
Yeah, so identity is complicated. And so when we think about, if someone asks you, who are you? There's all these factors that come into it. And so we have different roles we all play. We all wear different hats. I taught a law and ethics class this morning, though, so I told, teacher hat is 24/7. But among other hats, we all have roles. We are daughters and sons and brothers and sisters and spouses and, moms and dads. And so when we look at professional identity, we're looking at the aspect of your life and how you define yourself in your role as a professional. So in my research, we're looking at principals. And so how do principals see themselves in that role? How do they define who they are as a leader? So there's a lot of both internal, I already mentioned external and internal forces, but that go into play when you're constructing your identity. So there's formalized education, there's leadership training courses that we all took to become educational leaders. There are stakeholders and community members and society's perception of that role. And along with your personal self, you bring that to everything too. When I talk about professional identity, I think one of the things that was very evident early on is that it's pretty impossible to completely separate your personal and professional self. You always bring a little bit of who you are into the role. We all have, and no two people view professional identity in the same way because we all come from different, life experience. So in terms of identity, I mean, there's formalized definitions, like it's a set of meanings that you give to, a role based on all those external factors, that all play a part. So.
And that's what I find really interesting. One of the things that struck with me was that oftentimes we think that our identity is self-made. It's like, no, I am who I am because of what I believe and my values. And you made me really stop and consider, oh no, our identity is shaped both from internal and external forces, and that idea that, even something around like social media can affect how we see ourselves in our profession, a profession that, let's face it, many of us are very attached to.
Right. And I think it's important to note too that it's not fixed. If you ask people, and I did, who you were when you started this job, when you went into the principalship, how would you define your professional identity? And I realized too a lot of things, and trying to give people those words was maybe a bit a bit of a stumbling block at first. Like then I really had to go back in and kind of, if you ask somebody like, who are you as a principal? People will talk at length about that, So, but it changes. It changes over time. It changes with all those things that we just talked about, internal, external forces. So who you are now, 10, 15 years down the road, is not who you were when you started this job. I think we can all agree on that. So I think it's important for people to realize your identity does change, and it's okay for it should change. To hold on. Some people try to hold on to that so tightly, this idealized version of what the role should be. And, we'll get into it, but it can lead to, different outcomes in terms of your professional self.
I have one other word that I'd like you to talk to because I thought it was so interesting. I've seen bibliographies, I've seen a lot of ographies, but this is the first time I've seen a netnography. Tell us what that is and how do you get a netnography?
So netnography is, I don't know, it's kind of one of my favorite topics is because, like you said, it's like this black box. Like, what is it? So netnography was coined by a researcher, Dr. Robert Kozinets, and he's out of USC, so University of Southern California. And it is the study of online communities and digital traces. So it comes from the world of ethnography, where you study cultures, and a lot of people immerse themselves in those cultures to learn about them from the inside out, sort of. So the way I've approached netnography is sort of the same. So it is, monitoring, immersing yourself in online communities and gaining insights and data and all that good stuff that you need in research from those online communities. So for my study in particular, we used Facebook groups. So it's another way to study sort of people in what you would assume or hope is sort of a more honest, maybe raw element when they're posting in these sites, when they're commenting, when they're liking different things. And so when I thought about studying social media as sort of this big thing that's impacting principals, and I was going to different sites, and I was always part of these Facebook groups, and some of them, for support, some of them just for ideas. I really thought, wow, there is a lot of stuff in here. People talk in a more natural way when they're talking to a group of their peers than maybe they would in a formal interview. Um, and I thought, how powerful is that? And so that's when I found and stumbled across netnography and thought, this is great. This to study social media, I'm going to use social media. And so yeah, that's kind of how it evolved and how I landed on that. And so it's been a really, really interesting journey in myself, educating myself about this methodology, how you do research in social media sites, how you do it ethically, because there's always those implications when you're doing human research. And it's been really exciting. And I think it's yielded some, exciting results.
And what I am looking forward to is because I think that it's so different than what we usually get. Like I said, as you alluded to, a survey or an interview, you're getting a little bit more
Yeah.
raw. So that's why I'm really interested to get into some of your findings. So now you've done a lot of this research, and you've seen how social media can really affect the identity of school leaders. Tell us some of your big findings.
So from this, I mean, and this is where I said, like, spoiler alert, there's not, it's not going to come and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe it does that to people. Um, but I do think that, one of my main findings is that it impacts people differently. There's a differential impact on principals depending on how principals view themselves in the role. And so when you think about who we are as a principal, through all the social media posts that I analyzed, so there was 400 posts and then comments, and then I tracked all the reactions to those comments, who liked it, who loved it, who shared it, all those things, right? Because they all give you insight into how people are feeling. If something really resonated with people and 270 people loved it, that's a pretty good measure that this is something that's important to people. So a lot of principals that I spoke to in this study either conceptualized the role or thought about themselves as a parent. They used a lot of parent metaphors. My school, my kids. It happens to me. Like, it hurts. It hurts. It hurts me when they do things. That's not acceptable in my house. Why would I let my kids at school do that? Those types of comments. So when you conceptualize the role as a parent, and somebody criticizes your parenting skills online, that cuts a lot deeper than if somebody just says, terrible principal. Like, what are they doing? So we have one end of the spectrum of principals who are thinking of themselves, they're intertwining their personal and their professional identities really closely. There's very little divide between those two. And then we kind of on the other end of the spectrum, participants identified more as a manager, and their approach and their comments towards social media were really interesting. So I got things like, oh, water off a duck's back. I don't look at it unless I have to. And some people that stated that when they go home, they're home. They don't think about school. And so they are very separate in their, role conceptualization. They're able to really take a step back from that. And therefore, I mean, like I said, like this, it's common sense almost when you say it that way, but the data supports that, to say that it has less maybe of an impact on their professional identity or who they are, who they see themselves as a principal, because they're able to distance themselves from the role and the person. So that was one of the major findings. And then, we always want to, how do we explain this and how do we go deeper? And this is, PhD work and doctoral work. So we apply some theory to it. And so for my study, I used symbolic interactionism. So just people make meanings of different things and symbols. And so a Canadian, Irving Goffman, had a theory called dramaturgical analysis, where he saw everything from a perspective of a stage in a play. So he came up with different regions for identity construction and how people see themselves. And he was a sociologist, so we borrow this from sociology, but he had the concept of regions. So you have your front stage self and you have your backstage self. So when actors are preparing for a play, they prepare in the backstage. Nobody sees that. That's where your training happens. You memorize scripts, you read things. So we think about principals and, their backstage self. That's where your identity is formed. That's where you think about things, and it's ugly and messy back there. And, you cry in your office and nobody sees it because your door's closed because you're backstage. But when you go to the front stage, you're putting on a performance, in his words. You're taking everything you did in the backstage, the script memorization, the policy work, all that stuff, to talk to your parents, to talk to your students, to talk to your stakeholders. And so, all of those things. And he also had the idea of role embodiment, when you completely are like your self-concept and your role are completely one. And so the people who conceptualize things as parents also made comments to the effect that, they are the principal. That is who they are. When somebody asks, like, oh, who are you? Like, I'm not a mom, I'm not a wife, I'm not this, I'm a principal. And then you had the other end of the spectrum where we have like role distancing. And so that's when you separate from your role and your personal self, and you're able to water off a duck's back. You don't really think about that. So that was one of my, sort of big findings on paper, backed up, that the closer that you have your personal and professional identities, and the more you think about yourself, especially like these principles in a parental role, I hear people talk that way, and I think, I reflect on my own experience, and certainly is all consuming when I think about leading a school and those types of things. And so, I see how it happens, and I see those people, and what's a better principle? I don't know, especially after this study. I think we can get into future implications of research. But yeah, there's lots there. And so, like I said, so that was finding number one. That was really quite interesting.
I'm interested to know, because social media has gotten a bit of a bad rap lately, but
Mm-hmm.
originally we thought that this was such a technological breakthrough, was the ability to communicate quickly, often, easily with people all around the world. And so what I'm hearing you say, and I just want to make sure that I'm not reading into it too much, is
Mm-hmm.
that this is a force for both positive and for good and bad. I mean,
Sure.
if the conversation around your school and you are one of those parent identity type people, if it's positive, well, your tires are pumped, you're feeling on top of the world. But as soon as it goes negative, well, then you're negatively affected. Where these managers, it seems like there's less of that up and down, it's a little bit more in the middle. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and I think it's good to note too that this study was not looking for only negative interactions with social media. And so when we think about all those pieces that go into identity, and we look at stakeholder consultation, we always get feedback from others. And part of identity work is, how do others see us in our role? Because, there's different theorists that have, looking glass self, like we see ourselves reflected in how others see us. And that's how we conceptualize ourselves. But out of most of the people and most of the school leaders that I spoke to, there were people who mentioned positive interactions on social media, and it is that instantaneous feedback. And when it's great, it's great. And there's another part of my research that talks about people's proclivity to go to social media when they've had a negative experience. So there's all sorts of limitations to this study, because there are all those pieces. When people are happy and they had a great time at a restaurant, that's just almost like they don't go online all the time to like write rave reviews, but they sure will go online to write really, really terrible things about their experience so that nobody else has this experience. And they do the same for schools. And, so it is, it's a huge force, and it can be used. A lot of schools and divisions have different approaches to social media. So some have school Facebook groups, and some have school Instagram pages, and some used to have Twitter, now X, accounts. And some people are much more open to the idea of using it as a vehicle for communication than others. Some are more comfortable using it as others. And the the demographics of people that we are dealing with in the school system is certainly moving. There's more and more digital natives that grew up on the internet. So we talk about ourselves kind of straddling the line. Most principals, most teachers over the age of maybe 30, had a point in their life where they didn't have the internet. So they have the before and the after. And now kids growing up and their parents have never had a time, before social media. So how do we adapt, and how do we, embrace that going forward? I think advice someone gave to me a long time ago was always communicate to parents in the way that they communicate with you, or they want to communicate with you. So if they email you, you can email them or call them. But, when you bring in social media, is that a valid form of feedback? Is that something you want to entertain? All those types of things come into play.
Absolutely. Now, you said that identity conception was one of the findings. What are some of the other things that you found through this study?
I think so. There were two overarching ones. The second finding was really that principals, whether they want to or not, a lot of people expressed that they're being forced to renegotiate their identity, their professional identities, because the idealized educational instructional leader has now turned to crisis manager in terms of the principalship. And I don't use those words lightly. Those are the words of my participants, both from social media and, reverberated throughout the interviews that I did. We talk about people using metaphor, and this was certainly one of the places that they did the most. So the amount of people that articulated to me that they just do triage all day. They just keep putting Band-Aids on people because they can never get to the root cause of anything anymore. They're firefighters. So there was probably, a collection of quotes that just referenced fighting fires all day. And it was interesting because there was people who said that every Sunday night they tried to get back, they planned for the week because they were going to get into classrooms and be that educational leader that they wanted to be. But Monday morning came and they had, 3 subs short, and they needed to rearrange schedules and, get things like strikes happening. And so you never get to those leadership pieces of who you had aspired to be as a leader. So when you talk about Goffman and front stage, backstage, the backstage, you're preparing for educational leadership. This is you. You're going to change the world. And you go out there and you put that performance on, and that's not what you actually get to be anymore. Then you go back to the backstage and you're sort of renegotiating that. Okay, so today I just literally ran around the school. I put out fires all day, 27 quotes on social media that blew up. I had to have meetings, all those things. And so it creates this identity dissonance. And that is simply just a misalignment, sort of who you want to be and who you're forced to be, and sort of the fallout when that happens. So there's some emotional fallout. There's emotional impacts where people are taking that home in terms of stress, mental health concerns, burnout, and those things also turn into professional concerns and professional toll. And if we look at theory, it'll tell us that people are forced to so they have to renegotiate that identity, who you thought you were going to be as a principal. We talk about how it shifts depending on external, internal factors, what's happening, never static. So now you're looking at, do you adapt? So principals can adapt. They can take a survey of the landscape, and decide, all right, this is what my reality is. Am I going to just accept this and continue? Like I'm still here. I'm still working for the school. It's just different. And, accept that. Some principals can. Some principals can say that I just have to renegotiate my my ideal here, and what I am as a principal. And then some people decide to go back to the classroom. I had multiple people say, that do they think they're going to stay as principals for their career? Probably not. They want to go back to the classroom to, quote, do what they're good at, end quote. Um, and so those people are truly looking at their identity as still a teacher. Maybe they wanted to do educational leadership. It just didn't, it's not aligning with the work is not aligning with what they thought it would be. And that's okay. I don't want to say that as a negative. You want to have job satisfaction and you want alignment, obviously, and who you want to be and what your job is, all those things. And so the issue becomes, if you can't adapt and you can't renegotiate, what happens to you? And then we have role exit. And this is something that was very evident in social media. Many, 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 many posts about mid-year resignations, leaving early retirement, couldn't do it anymore, could not deal with parents anymore, couldn't listen to this. Then the comments and the likes and the shares, and I did it too. I had to leave. And I think anyone who works in education understands. Somebody said to me, well, everybody leaves jobs. Like, what does it matter? I said, the timing in education is everything. Many people lament over when they're going to go or what they're going to do or when they're going to take, have a surgery scheduled because they don't want to impact, the school too much. And to leave mid-year is huge for people. It speaks to their frustration, their desperation, because they've recognized, for many different reasons, that they cannot sustain this job anymore. And part of that, some people the participants in my study expressed that it was due to that dissonance that was happening, the disconnect between who they wanted to be, who they were, and this essentially was not what they signed up for. So.
Yeah. Interesting and slightly related is that we've been doing some research here in Alberta through the ATA and things like that. And so as, some of my work, looking at the how leaders see their wellness, especially their mental wellness, and how teachers see that. And so you talk about front stage and backstage. I think that leaders, additionally to their online perhaps identity and where they are in school, well, they do that backstage thing where they're not well. But as soon as they get out of the office, they put on the smile and they put on the brave face, and no one knows that it's hard or that they're struggling. And this leads to this disconnect between the staff or the teachers and them. And so we've got some research now showing that there's a 15 percentage point difference between if leaders are concerned for other leaders' mental health versus where teachers are concerned for school leaders' mental health. And so I think that speaks exactly to what you're talking about. Then now you get this further isolation, you get this further disconnection, and it's not what people signed up for. A lot of them, they signed up for this camaraderie or this connection. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and no one gets into this job for summers off, right? And so you get into this job because you truly want to make a difference, and you truly want to lead a school and a group of staff, students. And I think that's an important point to note is, staff sometimes become collateral damage in a lot of these things. Like we are here for the students, of course, but educational leaders are not just leading students and parents. The teachers that are there on the front line, they feel the impact of all of these things too, and a lot of times they're quite perceptive into what's going on. Even if a principal maybe is going through this struggle. And so, Goffman talks about impression management, and that's exactly what it sounds like. You're having this firefighter self backstage, and then you're making concessions and you're making adjustments, in your front stage performance, so that when you go out, no one knows what's going on behind the closed doors. Like he often in his books will talk about the restaurant like analogy. So on the surface, everything out on the service floor is great. Everyone's dining with tablecloths and it's calm and there's classical music playing, but behind that swinging door to the kitchen is chaos. People are screaming and you have Gordon Ramsay back there and all sorts of craziness going on. But when you go through that door, you pass through that, you know, that barrier, then everything's great. Everything's fine, calm, cool, collected. And so, how long can people sustain that, I think?
I'm interested now to get into the last part, and that is, okay, so what do we do about it? I think that it's becoming fashionable right now. I know that the first wave was when people started watching The Social Dilemma. They were just canceling all of their social media. I'm off.
Yeah.
I'm out of here. Um, is that what we should do, Erika? Should we just delete it all and live better lives and better professional lives, or what might your recommendation be?
Yeah, so I mean, no, that would I would say no, that is not realistic. And a lot of times, it's funny because principals will talk to me about how they don't have social media, like, but it doesn't matter if you have your own personal social media. A lot of times, like these things are brought to your door. This is something that happened about your school, and it's not, you can't bury your head in the sand. You do have to deal with it. And so, how do we equip principals? How do we equip educational leaders to deal with it? And I think maybe that's where the conversation needs to go. It's not going away. It's going to become more and more, in my opinion, just based on the I would say on the amount and sort of, the urgency with a lot with that with like, sort of a lot of these principals are posting. So that was one of my questions to people was, what do you have in place for support in terms of, division policy, or do you have someone you can call up if you're having these issues that can walk you through this? And most people felt they were on an island. So I think in terms of implications for future practice, or if we're talking nitty gritty like policy implications, I think that there needs to be some investigation maybe into ways that you can support principals through some of these issues that goes beyond just, a case by case basis where somebody calls a supervisor, a director, for direct support. When we think about how we develop leaders, and how they see themselves as a principal, and I think about some of the preparation courses and some of the different leadership courses people are required to take. Um, a lot of them just skim the surface of what you need to know. How do you do a budget? Like all these things are really important, but at the end of the day, that's not what keeps people up at night. Like the budget is not the big thing. I certainly was not really. I had maybe a couple hours and somebody with a spreadsheet that tried to teach me the operational budget, and I was fine. So I think that you know, not necessarily crisis management training, but maybe some training in how to interpret some of these things that are online, recognition that it's happening and recognition that it does impact people. Like you say, wellness is a hot topic, and wellness is, something people are recognizing that principals need, teachers need, everybody in the education system needs to take care of their wellness. But what does that actually mean, when it comes to things like social media or dealing with external stakeholders? It's interesting because the playbook is being rewritten, and we talk about social media evolving faster than we can keep up with policy, and when it comes to students and tech and all these other things, right? And this is one of those pieces that we can issue a cease and desist for somebody who's openly talking about us, or standing outside the school and the Trespass Act and all that good stuff. But what do you do when it's online? That's a hard one. So I don't know if I have an answer exactly for that.
Well, and here's what I would say is that I
Yeah.
think that even knowing your type, I even just saying, do you identify as a parent? Do you identify as a manager? Are there instances, can you shift back and forth? And just being aware that some of these positives or negative comments are going to affect you more or less depending on
Yeah,
what type of
sure.
relationship you have with your school. I think that that's powerful to know. And then,
Yeah. Sorry, go
as you
ahead.
said, developing some of those strategies to deal with it when things go sideways.
Yeah, and a lot of people mentioned they have like peer support, between people, right? So what's the first thing you do? You call a trusted colleague, like, oh my gosh, like they wrote this about, one of my teachers today. So I think, but maybe formalizing some of that peer and, mentorship and the peer support within educational leadership, and not just to meet on professional learning days and talk about, you know, an article or have a presenter, but really encourage people to reach out to each other to support them, especially in times where it feels very isolating, in the principalship sometimes. And I think that, having spaces where principals can go and discuss what's happening in their school, maybe guided but maybe not, and they can share their own strategies for what's working, and how they deal with some of these issues and these parents. And so a lot of the principals that are speaking in these Facebook groups that I've been researching, that's what they're going there for. They're going there for advice. They're going there for support. They're asking questions of, how did you deal? I have this happening. How do I deal with this? So that's obviously something that's missing within the leadership community, is this, support system that maybe you don't want to ask a director, but maybe you would ask your colleague. And if you're going to ask that colleague, I guarantee there's 4 other colleagues that all have the same question. So, how do we support principals in having and forming and maintaining those peer relationships and those support systems amongst themselves? I think that is certainly a worthy, maybe noble cause someone could look into.
Absolutely. Well, I think that this research is absolutely fascinating. I think it absolutely speaks to both my lived reality right now as a principal and what we talk about when I get together with many of my colleagues. So I want to thank you so much for A, doing this work, and B, for sharing a little bit with me and everyone listening today.
So much, Corey. There's a couple publications coming out from it, from different aspects of it, so it'll be a little bit more succinct and concise in terms of findings and things like that. But it's always a great conversation and timely, and I think that it's really important that people are having these conversations, with each other online, listening to these things, and so people don't feel quite so alone sometimes about it.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this edition of the Intersection Education Podcast. Please make sure that you subscribe to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes. Another great resource is to sign up for our newsletter on the website, intersectioneducation.com.